April 18, 1942. 12:15 p.m. Imperial Palace, Tokyo, Japan. Air Raid Observer Corporal Yasuo Watanabe adjusted his binoculars and scanned the crystal-clear sky above Tokyo Bay, performing the routine midday sweep that had become second nature after 4 months of war duty. The spring sun illuminated the imperial capital in perfect detail. The gleaming rooftops of the government district, the bustling harbor where merchant ships loaded supplies for the expanding Pacific Empire, the peaceful gardens where cherry blossoms had recently finished their annual display. Nothing in Watanabe's training had prepared him for what appeared in his field of view at 12:16 p.m. Twin-engine aircraft flying low and fast from the northeast, bearing the unmistakable white star insignia of the United States Army Air Forces. Not one aircraft but multiple formations, he counted quickly, 16 bombers in total, approaching the heart of the Japanese Empire with the confidence of aircraft operating in friendly airspace. Watanabe's hands trembled as he reached for his field telephone. This was impossible, utterly, completely impossible. American bombers over Tokyo. The nearest American airbase was thousands of miles away. No twin-engine bomber in the world had the range to reach Japan and return safely. The home islands were invulnerable. Every military briefing had emphasized this fundamental strategic reality. Command post, this is Observer Station 7. Watanabe spoke into the telephone, his voice cracking with disbelief. I'm reporting enemy aircraft over the capital. Twin-engine bombers, American markings, approximately 16 aircraft. The response was immediate and incredulous. Station 7, confirm your report. Did you say American bombers over Tokyo? Confirm, American B-25 Mitchell bombers flying at approximately 1,500 feet. Heading southwest over the Imperial District. This is not a drill. 3 miles away in the heavily fortified bunker beneath the Navy Ministry, Admiral Chuichi Nagamo was enjoying what he expected to be a routine strategic planning session. His carrier strike force had returned triumphant from the Pearl Harbor attack just 4 months earlier, and Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. The Philippines were falling. The Dutch East Indies were nearly conquered, and Wake Island had been captured after heroic resistance. More importantly, the Japanese mainland remained completely secure. Military geography made it impossible for American forces to threaten the home island. The closest U.S. air bases were in Hawaii, over 3,700 miles away, far beyond the range of any existing bomber. American aircraft carriers had been either sunk or driven back to the California coast. The possibility of enemy aircraft appearing over Japan was so remote that air defense planning focused primarily on training exercises. At 12:17 p.m., Admiral Nagamo's orderly burst through the conference room doors without the customary courtesy of requesting permission to enter. Admiral Nagamo, the young officer gasped, struggling to catch his breath. Air defense reports American bombers over Tokyo. Multiple aircraft, confirmed enemy markings. The strategic planning session came to an immediate halt. Admiral Saiichi Ito, the Navy's chief of operations, stood up so quickly that his chair toppled backward. That's impossible, he stated flatly. American bombers cannot reach Japan. Our intelligence estimates show no enemy aircraft with sufficient range. But even as Ito spoke, the distant sound of aircraft engines could be heard through the bunker's ventilation system. Not the familiar drone of Japanese aircraft conducting training flights, but the deeper, more aggressive sound of heavily loaded bombers running at full power. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Mori, Air Defense Coordinator for the Tokyo region, was experiencing his own crisis of disbelief at the Kasumagara Air Base 40 miles northeast of the capital. His radar operators had been tracking unidentified aircraft for the past hour, but the contacts had been dismissed as Japanese naval aircraft returning from training missions. When the aircraft reached the coast and continued inland without following standard identification procedures, confusion had turned to concern. Now, with visual confirmation of American bombers over the capital, concern had become panic. All fighter squadrons scramble immediately. Mori barked into his radio microphone. American bombers over Tokyo. Repeat. Enemy aircraft confirmed over the homeland. The response was sluggish and confused. Fighter pilots who had been relaxing in ready rooms, confident that no enemy threat could possibly reach Japan, scrambled to their aircraft in complete bewilderment. Many pilots initially refused to believe the scramble order was genuine, assuming it was an unannounced training exercise. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo, an experienced Zero fighter pilot with 6 kills over the Philippines, reached his aircraft and immediately radioed for clarification. Control, confirm the nature of this exercise. Are we intercepting simulated enemy bombers? This is not an exercise, came the frantic reply. Real American bombers, real American bombs, get airborne immediately. As Shindo's Mitsubishi A6M0 rolled down the runway, he struggled to comprehend the tactical situation. American bombers over Japan meant either that Japanese intelligence had catastrophically underestimated enemy capabilities, or that some unprecedented method of attack had been employed. Neither possibility had been considered in Japanese defensive plan. At the Yokosuka Naval Air Station, Base Commander Captain Minoru Genda was conducting his own desperate analysis of the impossible situation. Genda, one of the primary architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood better than most the range limitations of carrier-based aircraft. American carrier planes lacked the range to reach Japan from any safe launching position. Land-based bombers from Hawaii or the Philippines couldn't make the round trip. The geography of the Pacific made attack on the Japanese mainland strategically impossible. Where did they come from? Genda asked his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Yuao Matsuda. What have we missed in our assessment of American capabilities? Matsuda spread his charts across the plotting table, measuring distances with precise dividers. Sir, the nearest American bases are over 2,000 miles. The B-25 Mitchell has a maximum range of approximately 1,000 km. As Genda and Matsuda debated the impossibility of the situation, the first American bombs began falling on Japanese soil. High above Tokyo, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle maintained his B-25B Mitchell bomber at 1,500 feet, following the predetermined route that would take his formation over the most strategically important targets in the Japanese capital. Through his bombardier's window, he could see the citizens of Tokyo pointing skyward in obvious confusion and shock. Many Japanese on the streets below seemed more curious than frightened, apparently unable to process the reality that enemy aircraft were operating freely over their supposedly invulnerable homeland. What Doolittle and his fellow raiders couldn't know was that their appearance over Tokyo was causing a strategic earthquake that would reverberate through Japanese military planning for the remainder of the war. The psychological impact of 16 American bombers had already exceeded the physical damage they would inflict. The myth of Japanese invulnerability, carefully cultivated by 4 months of uninterrupted victory, was disintegrating in the bright spring sky over Tokyo. The home islands, sacred soil that no enemy had ever violated, were under attack by aircraft that weren't supposed to exist in this place at this time, under any conceivable circumstances. April 18, 1942, 1:45 p.m. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. General Hajime Sugiyama, Chief of the Army General Staff, stared at the large Pacific Ocean chart spread across the mahogany conference table, his finger tracing impossible flight paths as he searched for an explanation that would make sense of the afternoon's events. Around him, Japan's most senior military leaders engaged in increasingly frantic calculations, each one hoping to solve the strategic riddle that had just shattered their fundamental assumptions about homeland security. The bombers departed Tokyo airspace 90 minutes ago, heading southwest toward the China coast, reported Colonel Susumu Nishiura, Chief of the Army's Intelligence Division. Radio intercepts suggest 16 aircraft total, all B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, no escort fighters, no support aircraft. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, picked up his dividers and began measuring distances on the chart. Gentlemen, we must determine their origin point. If we can establish where these aircraft launched from, we can prevent future attacks. The problem was that every logical analysis led to the same impossible conclusion. The attack couldn't have happened. B-25 specifications, continued Nishiura, reading from an intelligence file. Maximum range 1,350 miles, with standard fuel load. Combat radius approximately 600 miles. To reach Tokyo and return to friendly territory would require, he paused for calculations, a round trip of at least 2,400 miles. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, present at the emergency session, raised the possibility that had been whispered in corridors, but not yet officially discussed. Could they have launched from aircraft carriers? American naval aviation attacking the mainland? Admiral Nagano shook his head emphatically. Absolutely impossible. No carrier-based aircraft has the range to reach Tokyo from any safe launching position. American carriers would have to approach within 300 miles of our coast, placing them well within range of our land-based aircraft. Our submarine patrols would have detected any carrier force long before it reached launching range. But as the afternoon progressed, Japanese intelligence analysts were forced to confront evidence that challenged every assumption about American capability. Radio intercepts from the bombers had been recorded by multiple listening stations, providing crucial clues about the raiders' origins and intentions. Lieutenant Commander Iwao Matsuda, the Navy's chief intelligence analyst, presented his preliminary findings to the assembled leadership. Sirs, we have recorded radio transmissions from the American aircraft. Analysis of signal strength and propagation characteristics suggests the bombers were operating at maximum range. They appeared to be at the extreme limit of their fuel endurance. This observation only deepened the mystery. If the raiders were at maximum range, where could they possibly have originated? Every known American base was far beyond the operational radius of medium bombers. Could they have staged through Soviet territory? Asked General Sugiyama. Secret bases in Siberia that we haven't detected. The suggestion was quickly dismissed by foreign ministry representatives who maintained detailed knowledge of Soviet-American relations. Impossible, General. The Soviets are maintaining strict neutrality in the Pacific War. They would never risk Japanese retaliation by allowing American bombers to operate from their territory. Captain Minoru Genda, who had arrived from Yokosuka Naval Air Station, offered another theory that had been circulating among aviation specialists. Perhaps they modified the aircraft, stripped out all non-essential equipment, added extra fuel tanks, accepted a one-way mission profile. Suicide bombers willing to crash in China rather than attempt a return flight. This explanation had some merit. Intelligence reports suggested that some of the raiders had indeed continued toward China rather than attempting to return to their launch point. But even one-way missions had range limitations, and the mathematics still didn't work for any known American base. At 2:30 p.m., a priority intelligence report arrived from the Navy's radio intercept station at Owada. The report contained fragments of American radio transmissions that had been recorded during the attack, including partial conversations between bomber crews and their ground controller. Listen to this intercept, said Commander Tateshi Naito, the Navy's communications intelligence specialist, reading from a decoded transcript. American bomber to control package delivered successfully. Proceeding to alternative recovery field as brief. Control to bomber. Roger. Understand alternative recovery. Good luck with the long flight home. The phrase long flight home suggested that the raiders were indeed attempting to return to their base rather than conducting a one-way mission. But this only made the range equation more impossible to solve. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had been notably silent during the strategic discussion. As the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most experienced naval aviation strategist, his analysis would carry enormous weight. When he finally spoke, his words carried the authority of hard-won expertise. Gentlemen, Yamamoto said quietly, we are approaching this problem from the wrong direction. Instead of asking where they came from, we should ask what new capability they possess that we haven't recognized. Yamamoto walked to the chart and placed his finger on a point approximately 600 miles east of Tokyo, well out to sea. Just suppose that American engineers have found a way to launch land-based bombers from aircraft carriers. Suppose they have solved the technical problems that we believe make such operations impossible. The room fell silent as Japan's senior military leaders contemplated this revolutionary possibility. Launching Army bombers from Navy carriers violated every principle of naval aviation that they understood. The aircraft were too heavy, the takeoff distances too long, the landing speeds too high. It was aeronautically impossible. "Sir," ventured Captain Genda, "our own tests have shown that medium bombers cannot operate from carrier decks. The structural stresses, the weight limitations, the landing characteristics, all of these factors make carrier operations impossible for land-based aircraft." Yamamoto nodded, acknowledging of Genda's technical expertise. "You are correct, Captain. Carrier operations for land-based bombers are impossible if you assume normal operating procedures. But what if the Americans have abandoned normal procedure? What if they launched the bombers from carriers with no intention of recovering them aboard ship?" This concept, one-way launches from carriers with recovery on land bases, was so far outside conventional thinking that it had never been seriously considered by Japanese planners. The idea sacrificed the fundamental principle of naval aviation, the ability to recover aircraft aboard ship for reuse in subsequent operations. But it would solve the range equation. A carrier could approach to within 600 miles of Japan, launch bombers on a one-way mission to Tokyo, then withdraw to safety while the aircraft continued to airfields in China. The bombers would be lost to the carrier force, but they could potentially be recovered and reused from Chinese base. As the implications of this theory sank in, the assembled leadership realized they were facing a strategic revolution. If American forces could conduct one-way carrier launches of medium bombers, then no target within 1,000 miles of navigable waters was safe from attack. The protection that geography had provided to the Japanese mainland had just evaporated. "If this theory is correct," said General Sugiyama slowly, "then our entire defensive strategy must be reconsidered. We have allocated our fighter strength based on the assumption that only carrier-based aircraft could threaten the homeland. If medium bombers can reach us from the sea." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Every officer in the room understood the implication. Japan's fighter defenses would need to be dramatically strengthened. Resources that had been allocated to offensive operations in the Pacific would have to be recalled for homeland defense. The strategic initiative that Japan had maintained since Pearl Harbor was suddenly in question. As the emergency conference entered its third hour, Japanese military leaders found themselves confronting a new and disturbing reality. American forces had just demonstrated a capability that shouldn't exist. Launched from a location that couldn't be determined, using methods that violated every assumption about the limitations of military aviation. The impossible had happened, and the Japanese Empire would never feel secure again. April 18, 1942, 8:20 a.m. USS Hornet, 650 miles east of Tokyo. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stood on the pitching deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, watching salt spray from the heavy seas crash over the bow and soak the 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers lashed to the flight deck. The morning sky was gray and threatening, with 30-knot winds driving whitecaps across the storm-tossed Pacific. In any rational assessment of the situation, the conditions were impossible for launching heavily loaded medium bombers from a carrier deck. But rationality had been abandoned the moment this mission was conceived. "Colonel," shouted Lieutenant Henry Miller, the Navy's flight deck officer, over the howling wind, "we've got the deck spotted for launch. First aircraft ready for engine start." Doolittle nodded and walked toward his B-25B, the lead aircraft in a formation that was about to attempt something that violated every principle of naval aviation. Army bombers launching from Navy carriers was supposed to be impossible. The aircraft were too heavy, the takeoff runs too long, the margin for error too small. But impossible had become the mission's middle name. The genesis of the Doolittle Raid lay in President Roosevelt's demand for retaliation against Japan following Pearl Harbor. "I want Japan bombed as soon as possible," Roosevelt had told his military advisors in December. The problem was that no American base was within range of the Japanese mainland, and carrier-based aircraft lacked the payload and range for a meaningful strike. The solution had come from an unlikely source. Navy Captain Francis Lowe, who noticed Army B-25 bombers practicing short takeoffs at Norfolk Naval Air Station. "What if we could launch those from a carrier?" Lowe had asked. Admiral Ernest King. It was a question that would lead to months of seemingly impossible engineering challenges. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding officer of the Hornet, had been skeptical when briefed on the mission 2 months earlier. Admiral, he had told Admiral William Halsey, my flight deck is 800. Those B-25s need at least 1,200 feet for takeoff with a combat load. The physics don't work. But Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and his volunteer crews had been working frantically to make the physics work. Every non-essential component had been stripped from the bombers to reduce weight. Extra fuel tanks had been installed in place of radio equipment. The aircraft had been modified with special lightweight bomb racks and simplified control systems. Most crucially, the B-25 crews had practiced short takeoffs until they could get airborne in distances that defied normal operating procedures. At Eglin Field in Florida, Doolittle's pilots had practiced launching their bombers in 450 feet, less than half the normal takeoff distance required for their aircraft. The secret, Doolittle had explained to his pilots during training, is that we're not conducting normal takeoff. We're conducting controlled crashes forward. Get the aircraft into the air by any means necessary, then sort out the flying once you're airborne. The volunteer nature of the mission had created a unique esprit de corps among the 80 air crew members. Every man had volunteered for an extremely hazardous mission without knowing the target or the method of attack. When the details were finally revealed, not a single crew member had requested transfer. Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, tail gunner on the 7th B-25, checked his equipment one final time as his aircraft's engines roared to life. The bomber carried 4 500-pound bombs in modified bomb bays, enough high explosive to cause significant damage to industrial targets. But Bramer understood that the psychological impact of the mission would far exceed its physical destruction. We're going to scare the hell out of them, Bramer told his crew over the intercom. They think they're safe on their little islands. We're about to prove them wrong. At 8:24 a.m., with the Hornet pitching violently in the heavy seas, Doolittle's B-25 began its takeoff roll. The bomber, loaded far beyond its normal aircraft carrier weight limitations, struggled to accelerate on the water-soaked flight deck. As the aircraft approached the bow of the carrier, it was still well below normal flying speed, but Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle had spent months perfecting the technique for impossible takeoff. As his bomber reached the end of the flight deck, he pulled back on the controls and literally flew the aircraft off the carrier through sheer pilot skill and determination. The B-25 dropped toward the ocean's surface, gathered speed and ground effect, then climbed slowly away from the ship. Captain Mitcher, watching from the bridge, later described the sight as the most beautiful and most frightening thing I've ever seen at sea. Those bombers had no business getting airborne from my deck, but they did it anyway through pure pilot skill. One by one, the remaining 15 B-25s followed Doolittle's example. Each takeoff was a controlled catastrophe that somehow resulted in a flyable aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber dropped so low after leaving the deck that his propellers threw salt spray from the wave top. Lieutenant Donald Smith's aircraft barely cleared the bridge superstructure, missing the ship's radio antennas by less than 10 feet. But every aircraft got airborne. 16 Army bombers launched from a Navy carrier in conditions that should have made the operation impossible were now heading west toward Japan at maximum range and minimum altitude. The technical achievement was staggering. The B-25 Mitchell, designed for operation from 6,000-foot runways with careful weight and balance calculations, had been successfully launched from an 800-foot carrier deck in rough sea. The mission represented a triumph of American engineering, pilot skill, and sheer determination over seemingly impossible odds. Navigator Lieutenant Carl Wildner, aboard the 10th B-25, calculated their position as the bombers formed up for the flight to Japan. 650 miles to target, he announced over the intercom. We're at absolute maximum range for this mission. If we encounter headwinds or have to deviate from course, we won't have fuel to reach the Chinese airfields. The fuel calculations were indeed desperate. Each bomber carried just enough gasoline to reach Japan, attack their targets, and continue to friendly airfields in China, assuming perfect weather, no navigation errors, and no combat damage. There was no reserve fuel for contingencies, no margin for error. But the mission had been designed as a demonstration of American reach and determination rather than a conventional military operation. The 16 bombers carried enough explosive power to damage Japanese industrial facilities, But more importantly, they carried proof that American forces could strike anywhere Japanese territory existed. Lieutenant Harold Watson, pilot of the 6th B-25, understood the strategic implications better than most. "This isn't really about the bombs we're carrying," he told his crew as they flew west toward Japan. "This is about proving that they can't hide behind geography anymore. If we can reach Tokyo, we can reach anywhere." As the formation of 16 B-25s disappeared into the western sky, the USS Hornet turned east and began the dangerous journey back to friendly water. The carrier had just accomplished something that naval aviation experts had declared impossible: launching a formation of medium bombers on a combat mission against enemy territory. But the real impossibility was yet to come. In 4 hours, those 16 aircraft would appear over Tokyo like aircraft materialized from thin air, shattering Japanese confidence and forcing a complete re-evaluation of homeland defense strategy. The audacious plan that had seemed impossible to conceive, impossible to execute, and impossible to survive was about to prove that American determination could overcome any obstacle, including the basic laws of physics and naval aviation. April 19, 1942, 6:00 a.m., Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone in his office studying intelligence reports and reconnaissance photographs from the previous day's attack while the first gray light of dawn illuminated the damage that 16 American bombers had inflicted on the supposedly invulnerable Japanese mainland. The physical destruction was relatively minor. Some industrial facilities damaged, a few military installations hit, minimal casualties. But the strategic implications were catastrophic. On his desk lay a priority directive from Emperor Hirohito himself. The homeland must never again be subjected to enemy attack. Whatever resources are required for absolute defense will be provided immediately. Yamamoto understood that this single sentence would fundamentally alter Japan's strategic position in the Pacific War. Resources that had been allocated for offensive operations against Australia, India, and Hawaii would now be recalled for homeland defense. The strategic initiative that Japan had maintained since Pearl Harbor was being sacrificed to protect against attacks that might never come. But after yesterday's impossible raid, Japanese planners could no longer assume that future attacks were impossible. At 6:15 a.m., Admiral Izami Nagano arrived for the emergency strategic conference that would reshape Japanese military priorities. His face showed the strain of 18 hours spent trying to solve the riddle of how American bombers had reached Tokyo. "Yamamoto," Nagano said without preamble, "our overnight analysis confirms your theory. The Americans launched medium bombers from aircraft carriers approximately 650 miles east of Tokyo. One-way missions with recovery planned at Chinese airfields." The confirmation brought no satisfaction to Yamamoto. If anything, it made the strategic situation worse. American forces had just demonstrated the ability to project air power using methods that Japanese intelligence had never considered. The implications were staggering. "How many aircraft carriers do the Americans have remaining?" Yamamoto asked, though he already knew the answer would disturb him. "Intelligence estimates suggest at least 8 fleet carriers still operational," Nagano replied. "If each carrier can launch 16 medium bombers on one-way missions, they could potentially put over 100 bombers over any target within 1,000 miles of navigable water." The mathematics were terrifying. Every major Japanese city was within 1,000 miles of the ocean. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, all were vulnerable to carrier-launched bomber attacks that could arrive with no warning and no opportunity for interception at sea. "What are our defensive options?" Yamamoto asked, dreading the answer. Nagano spread a series of charts across the conference table, each one marked with defensive fighter deployments that had seemed adequate 24 hours earlier, but now appeared woefully insufficient. "Currently, we have 48 operational fighters assigned to homeland defense," Nagano reported. "The majority of our fighter strength is deployed with offensive operations, 260 aircraft supporting the advance toward Australia, 180 aircraft preparing for operations against India, 140 aircraft allocated for the planned attack on Hawaii." The numbers revealed the strategic bind that Japan now faced. The Empire's military success had been built on offensive operations that kept enemy forces far from Japanese territory. But offensive operations required massive fighter support, leaving minimal resources for homeland defense that had seemed unnecessary. How many fighters would we need for adequate homeland defense? Yamamoto asked. Against carrier-launched bomber attack. Nagano consulted his planning documents. Minimum 300 fighters for the Tokyo region alone, another 200 for Osaka and the industrial areas, an additional 150 for naval bases and military facilities. We're looking at 650 fighters minimum for credible homeland defense. Yamamoto performed the grim calculation, recalling 650 fighters from offensive operations would cripple Japan's ability to expand the Pacific perimeter. The planned attacks on Hawaii and Australia would have to be cancelled. The offensive momentum that had carried Japanese forces across half the Pacific would grind to a halt. But the alternative was even worse. If American forces could repeat yesterday's attack with larger formation, they could systematically destroy Japan's industrial capacity while the bulk of Japanese fighters remained thousands of miles away supporting offensive operations that would become meaningless if the homeland was reduced to ruin. At 7:30 a.m., General Hajime Sugiyama arrived with additional disturbing intelligence. Admirals, he announced, our agents in China report that several of the American bombers successfully reached Chinese airfields. At least some of the aircraft and crews survived the mission. This information transformed the raid from a desperate one-way attack into a successful demonstration of American operational capability. If the bombers and crews could be recovered and reused, the Americans had proven they could conduct repeated attacks on Japanese territory using methods that Japanese defenses couldn't counter. Worse, Sugiyama continued, Chinese nationalist forces are publicly celebrating the raid. They're treating the American air crews as heroes and providing full support for their recovery operations. The psychological impact is spreading throughout occupied China. The political ramifications were as serious as the military implications. Japan's control over occupied territories depended partly on the perception of Japanese invincibility. Yesterday's raid had shattered that perception in the most dramatic way possible. Enemy bombers attacking the heart of the Japanese Empire while Japanese forces were powerless to prevent it. Yamamoto reached for his secure telephone and placed a call to Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet currently operating in the Indian Ocean. The conversation was brief and decisive. Nagamo, cancel operations against Ceylon. Recall all available fighters to Japan immediately. We're implementing emergency homeland defense protocols. Similar calls went out to commanders across the Pacific. Admiral Raizo Tanaka was ordered to suspend operations against Australia and redeploy his air units to Japanese base. Admiral Bashiro Hosogaya received instructions to recall fighters from the Aleutian operation. Every offensive operation was being scaled back to provide fighters for homeland defense. The strategic reversal was unprecedented in Japanese military history. For the first time since the Meiji Restoration, Japan was shifting from offensive to defensive operations not because of military defeats in the field, but because the homeland itself was under threat. By 10:00 a.m. priority telegrams were arriving at Japanese air bases across the Pacific. Fighter squadrons that had been preparing for offensive operations against Allied positions were receiving orders to pack their equipment and return to Japan immediately. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo, the Zero pilot who had scrambled unsuccessfully to intercept the raiders, received news that his squadron would be permanently stationed at Kazumigara Air Base near Tokyo. The assignment meant abandoning plans for operations against Australian airfields and accepting a defensive mission that violated every principle of Japanese military doctrine. Defensive operations, Shindo told his wingman, Lieutenant Hiroshi Okamura, our admission that we can't control the initiative anymore. Yesterday, 16 American bombers changed our entire strategic position. The resource calculations were staggering. Each fighter recalled from offensive operations represented not just the aircraft itself, but the pilots, maintenance crews, spare parts, fuel supplies and logistical support required to keep the unit operational. Moving 650 fighters from offensive to defensive missions would require a massive reallocation of Japan's military resources. More critically, the fighters recalled for homeland defense would be unavailable for future offensive operations. Japan's ability to expand the Pacific perimeter, attack Allied supply lines, or conduct strategic bombing operations would be permanently reduced by the need to maintain massive fighter defenses against attacks that might or might not come. As the day progressed, The full scope of the strategic earthquake became clear. The Doolittle Raid had accomplished something that no previous Allied military operation had achieved. It had forced Japan to abandon offensive operations and assume a defensive posture based on fear of future attack. 16 American bombers appearing over Tokyo for less than an hour had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The psychological impact of the impossible attack would resonate through Japanese military planning for the remainder of the conflict, ensuring that significant resources remain tied down in homeland defense rather than supporting offensive operations. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and advocate of decisive offensive action, found himself implementing the defensive strategy he had always opposed. The irony was bitter but inescapable. Japan's most aggressive naval strategist was now planning for the defense of Japanese territory against enemies who had proven they could strike from anywhere, at any time, using methods that defied conventional military analysis. June 4, 1942, 10:30 a.m., 2,000 miles northwest of Midway Island, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching his air groups return from their strike against Midway Atoll, and realized that the strategic burden imposed by the Doolittle Raid was about to cost him the most important naval battle of the war. 6 weeks after 16 American bombers had shattered Japanese confidence in homeland security, the consequences were playing out 3,000 miles from Tokyo in ways that Jimmy Doolittle could never have imagined. "Admiral," reported his air operations officer, Commander Minoru Genda, "American dive bombers approaching from the northeast. Large formation, estimated 30 aircraft. Nagumo's combat air patrol should have been positioned to intercept the American attack, but half of his best fighter pilots were no longer available for offensive operations. They had been recalled to Japan for homeland defense following the Tokyo raid. The Zeros that might have saved his carriers were sitting on airfields around Tokyo waiting to intercept American bombers that might never come. The strategic mathematics were brutal and inescapable. The 20 fighters that Nagumo had lost to homeland defense represented his most experienced pilots and his most reliable aircraft. Their absence at Midway meant that American dive bombers would face significantly lighter defensive fire when they began their attack runs on his carrier. At 10:32 a.m. the first American SBD Dauntless dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading the attack on the Akagi, could see Japanese fighters scrambling desperately to intercept his formation, but there weren't enough of them. The defensive umbrella that should have protected the Japanese carriers had been thinned by strategic decisions made in Tokyo conference rooms 6 weeks earlier. The psychological impact of the Doolittle Raid had proven more devastating than the physical damage. Japanese military leadership, traumatized by the impossible appearance of American bombers over Tokyo, had fundamentally altered their strategic priorities based on fear rather than rational analysis. Emperor Hirohito himself had been deeply shaken by the raid. Palace officials reported that the emperor had been profoundly disturbed by evidence that enemy aircraft could reach the sacred precincts of the imperial capital. His demand for absolute homeland defense had carried the weight of imperial command, making rational strategic discussion impossible. The result was a defensive psychosis that infected every level of Japanese military planning. Resources were allocated not based on probable threats, but on the traumatic memory of 16 bombers appearing where bombers weren't supposed to exist. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, now serving as a planning officer in North Africa, would never know that his audacious raid had directly contributed to American victory at Midway. The fighters that might have saved Nagumo's carriers were defending Tokyo against attacks that existed only in the nightmares of Japanese planners. As the Akagi began listing heavily to port, taking on water from multiple bomb hits, Nagumo contemplated the strategic chain reaction that had brought him to this moment. The Doolittle Raid had created a crisis of confidence that forced Japan to abandon its offensive strategy and assume a defensive posture that made victory impossible. The mathematics of the Pacific War had been fundamentally altered by psychological rather than physical damage. Japan's industrial capacity remained largely intact. Her military forces were still formidable, and her strategic position was still strong. But the confidence that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific had been shattered by the demonstration that American forces could strike the homeland using methods that Japanese intelligence had never anticipated. Admiral Yamamoto, observing the Midway battle from his flagship 300 miles away, understood that Japan was losing more than aircraft carrier. The offensive spirit that had carried Japanese forces from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to Java was dying in the waters around Midway. Killed not by superior enemy tactics but by the defensive mentality that had infected Japanese strategy since April. The Americans didn't need to destroy our fleet at Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto confided to his chief of staff, Captain Kuroshima. They just needed to prove they could reach Tokyo. Once we started fearing for the homeland, we lost the initiative that was our only path to victory. The strategic reverberations of the Doolittle Raid extended far beyond the allocation of fighter squadrons. Japanese industrial planning had been disrupted by demands for enhanced air defense systems. Radar installations, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter aircraft production had received priority over offensive weapons development. Resources that should have gone into building additional aircraft carriers or long-range bombers were diverted to defensive systems protecting against future raids. More critically, the raid had destroyed Japanese confidence in their geographic advantages. The island empire's greatest strategic asset had been its distance from enemy bases. When American ingenuity demonstrated that distance was no protection against determined attack, Japan's fundamental defensive assumption had been invalidated. In Tokyo, air raid drills had become a daily routine. Citizens who had never imagined that enemy aircraft could reach the capital now practiced blackout procedures and emergency evacuation routes. The psychological security that had sustained Japanese morale during the early war years had been replaced by constant anxiety about future attack. General Hideki Tojo, Japan's prime minister and war minister, found himself allocating enormous resources to civil defense programs that produced no military advantage. Air raid shelters, evacuation procedures, and emergency services consumed materials and manpower that were desperately needed for offensive operations in the Pacific. "We are fighting a defensive war now," Tojo told his cabinet. "The Americans have forced us to defend everything, which means we can defend nothing adequately." The strategic transformation was complete. Japan, which had begun the Pacific War with unlimited confidence in offensive action, had been maneuvered into a defensive posture by a single raid that inflicted minimal physical damage but maximum psychological trauma. By December 1942, 8 months after the Doolittle Raid, Japanese forces were in retreat across the Pacific. Guadalcanal had been lost, the Solomon Islands campaign was failing, and American industrial production was beginning to overwhelm Japanese defensive capability. The strategic initiative had passed to American forces who were no longer constrained by geographic limitations. The final irony was that no subsequent American raid on the Japanese mainland employed the carrier-launched bomber technique that had so traumatized Japanese planners. The Doolittle Raid remained unique, a one-time demonstration of American ingenuity that had forced Japan to prepare for attacks that would never come, using methods that would never be repeated. As 1942 ended, Admiral Yamamoto reflected on the strategic revolution that 16 American bombers had accomplished in 90 minutes over Tokyo. The physical damage had been repaired within weeks. The psychological damage had proven permanent and catastrophic. "They broke something in us that day," Yamamoto wrote in his private diary. "Not our ships or our aircraft or our bases, but our confidence in the impossible. We learned that Americans could do things we thought were impossible, and that knowledge made us afraid." The fear had proven more destructive than any conventional military defeat. Japanese forces continued to fight with courage and skill, but they fought defensively, cautiously, always looking over their shoulders for the next impossible American innovation. The myth of Japanese invulnerability, carefully constructed over decades of military success, had been demolished by 16 Army bombers that shouldn't have been able to reach Tokyo. The demonstration that American forces could strike anywhere, anytime, using methods that defied conventional analysis, had transformed Japanese strategy from confident offense to anxious defense. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's 30 seconds over Tokyo had changed the course of the Pacific War, not through the bombs his raiders dropped, but through the proof they provided that geography could not protect Japan from American determination and ingenuity. The age of Japanese expansion was ending in the skies over Midway, killed by the defensive mindset that had been born in the impossible moment when American bombers appeared over Tokyo from nowhere.